concerns. And there's the Daily Telegraph telling us that the cabinet is split over tougher lockdown. The Times has the story that we started with: soaring virus rate leaves Britain on lockdown alert. Interesting one in the Eye: reveal medics are saving more second wave patients. So there's some positive news. I tell you that when we can, we try and stress positive. So let's take positive news there. Medics save more second wave of patients, so we can celebrate that. The Guardian, no real surprise. Universities scrapping face-to-face teaching as student infections soar. I think if you are a student or you have a loved one who's a student, you probably knew that already. The Metro talks about fake flu news. This is, of course, the story you've heard on the LBC News Bulletin. Donald Trump accused of spreading fake news as Twitter and Facebook censored his posts, suggesting coronavirus is, his words by the way, now far less lethal than the flu. With all this going on, the Sun, and my goodness, it's important, it's absolutely important, the Poppy appeal. On October the 7th, they decide to suddenly get behind that and devote virtually their entire front page with the headline, "Every Poppy Counts." Indeed it does, but I don't know if today's the day to do all of that. Now, normally the Prime Minister giving an address to his or her party conference would be front page news. Only the Daily Mirror and the Daily Express give it that treatment, and I have to say for the Daily Mirror, actually it's smaller, has smaller treatment than does the Stars, who are taking part in Strictly Come Dancing. The Mirror, not surprising, very much a Labour supporting paper, calls him a wind bag. This is a rather extraordinary suggestion that wind will be to wind what Saudi Arabia is to oil, whatever that expression was. The Daily Express possibly more supportive. We will come out of this darkness fighting fit. And let's turn to the Prime Minister's speech. Just remind you a couple of parts of it. Then we're going to speak with a very eminent former speechwriter to a former Prime Minister, and also a political editor who's a very close friend of the Prime Minister. But first, let's go back to that speech yesterday. I say again, not an ideal venue for Boris Johnson. He is a crowd pleaser. He warms to having an audience. So doing it online to presumably half a dozen people looking at him was never going to necessarily be absolutely his home turf. But here he is saying, and on this bit I do agree, he's heartily sick of COVID.
I don't know about you, but I have had more than enough of this disease, and we will succeed, just as this country has seen off every alien invader for the last 1,000 years. We human beings will simply not content ourselves with a repair job. We see these moments as the time to learn and to improve on the world that went before.
And I have absolutely no idea whether he was referring to me, but I've said on the radio and I've said in print that I think he's not the Boris Johnson that I knew. I'm sure he wasn't referencing me, but he addressed that issue.
I've read a lot of nonsense recently about how my own bout of COVID has somehow robbed me of my mojo. And of course this is self-evident drivel, the kind of seditious propaganda that you would expect from people who don't want this government to succeed, who wanted to stop us delivering Brexit and all our other manifesto pledges. And I can tell you that no power on earth was and is going to do that. And I could refute these critics of my athletic abilities in any way they want. Arm wrestling, leg wrestling, Cumberland wrestling, sprint off, you name it. And yet, I have to admit, the reason I had such a nasty experience with the disease is that although I was superficially in the pink of health when I caught it, I had a very common underlying condition. My friends, I was too fat.
Let's turn to Gitto Harry, who is political editor of GQ magazine, a surface spokesman for Boris Johnson while Mayor of London. And Gitto, I remind the listeners, of course, you have competed against him athletically. You and he had a running race somewhere in the world.
Indeed, at the Olympic Stadium in Beijing, and I beat him in the last 10 metres of a 100-metre sprint when we were in suits and unsuitable shoes, and he's never forgiven me. But yes.
Has he got it? Did he ever lose his mojo, Gitto? If so, did he get it back?
I don't know. I know what you're getting at, and in the end, it's one thing for me to say I haven't lost my mojo, but if I haven't, you want other people to say no, he's got his mojo back, and that's something that people are not entirely convinced of at the moment. It's good that he says it. He says it in private as well. He says he's never felt fitter, that he's back to where he was, ahead of that race in Beijing. But people are not seeing it, and part of that is that they see a man who seems to be hiding behind the science, and nobody's going to go out there and say ignore the scientists. But being a politician means going beyond the science and beyond the ideologies and beyond the opinion polls and beyond the sort of focus groups. It is about that big judgment call that looks slightly mad sometimes, and then you realise down the line that it was the right call to make. The Boris who had his mojo was the Boris who stuck up for the bankers when everybody else wanted to lynch them. Until years later we were glad that we hadn't destroyed our financial industry. And what we need to see, I think, is a bit more clarity of purpose, a bit more vision. There's a bit of it on display yesterday, but it's it's a work in progress at the moment.
You know him so well. You've probably crafted speeches for him. You've helped him with presentation. What did you take from yesterday, Peter?
Well, I think he's frustrated at the idea that people think he has lost his mojo. He's frustrated, no doubt, that, a time when he wanted to be spelling out a vision for the UK, he wanted to be building things, he genuinely wanted to be going to the north of England saying you are no longer neglected, and instead of that, he's not meeting anybody. He's cooped up in Downing Street, presiding over something that is anathema to him, bullying people, telling them what to do, shutting them in their homes, shutting down their businesses, telling them to wear masks on the street. It's the exact opposite of what somebody like him wants to do in politics, and that is frustrating, and he can't wait to come out the other end. The problem is that he's the person who's going to get us through to the other end of this dark tunnel, and I think he needs to step back a little bit and rediscover not just his mojo, but a sense of clarity and purpose and consistency and coherence, and yes, make some of those calls that we think that's a big call to make.
Gitto, always good speaking. Thanks so much. Best wishes to you. Check out Gitto's work, political editor of GQ magazine, and he served as spokesperson for Boris Johnson when Mr Johnson was mayor of London. Let's get into the speech now in more detail. Philip Collins was chief speechwriter to Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister, and now is writer-in-chief for the draft. Philip, I'll ask you in a minute to just explain in a sentence what the draft is, but also, Philip, reflect on this for one newspaper, very much a supporting newspaper. Boris Johnson yesterday was a dazzling vision of post-COVID Britain, channeling the spirit of Margaret Thatcher. Philip Collins joins me now. Philip, what is the draft in a sentence? Morning.
The draft is a couple of right speeches for whoever wants them. So, hey, we're done for hire.
Okay, you can do my column for the Sunday Express this week. Philip, so this is a dazzling vision of post-COVID Britain. Break it down for me.
Well, that was certainly the attempt. It was a very peculiar speech, as you've just gone through the newspapers. Very odd that they're not leading on it, and also a very odd situation to give a speech with no audience. Very difficult. So what he decided to do was to essentially ignore the current predicaments of politics, which is how to get through this virus and how are we going to get through the recession that's inevitably coming its way. There's virtually nothing on either of those two bits, and it was a picture of what Britain might be like if everything went smoothly 20 years hence. Now that's a fairly standard technique in writing a speech. I mean, I've done that myself for a multi-conference speech, so there's nothing wrong with it. You do usually have to build a bridge to that utopia. You have to say how you're going to get there, or at least imply how you're going to get there. And that was the missing thing in the speech. There was really nothing other than a vision of how marvelous everything's going to be attached to the claim that, yes, I've got my mojo back. And what it led me thinking is, even if Boris Johnson has got his mojo back, having a mojo isn't enough if you're Prime Minister. It's incredibly tough job, and I think in fact what's happening is he's struggling to do it. I think he's finding it hard to be anxious.
Let me ask you this. We're going to fix the care system. We're going to go green. We're going to build houses. I've heard this so many times before. I think I read most of it in their manifesto. Again, to your point, there was no detail. It's just headlines.
Yeah, there was nothing. I mean, you've actually heard some of those things from David Cameron and Theresa May before. And no doubt Tony Blair is pretty much about it. So, yes, exactly. You've heard these things many different times. And it's a very laudable ambition. And indeed, those are the other things I'll take my hat off to. But, as you say, there was no suggestion of how you do a speech like this. You can't give details of all of those things. So you always take at least one, and you use that as a centerpiece, as the illustration of how serious you are about change, and you give some detail, you give a little bit, and certainly in the accompanying briefings, etc., you'd be full of detail for anybody who wanted them, to give the sense that this wasn't just talk. I didn't get that at all from yesterday's speech. There was nothing further, and so it led you thinking, well, it's a very tough time. You've got no money. You've had a chancellor the day before saying, well, it's somehow going to balance the books. You're very reluctant to add extra taxation to the country, understandably. So how on earth are you going to find all the money for these promises? That leaves you bewildered, really.
Always good speaking with you, Philip. Thank you. Philip Collins was chief speechwriter to Prime Minister Tony Blair. He's now writer-in-chief for The Draft. Check that out if you need a speech writing for you. Or any sort of speeches or presentation. I'm sure Philip's happy to help. All right, coming up after you is another aspect, and this is where you really can get involved, because so many of you would have presumably wished to, well, you're young yourself if you're saving up your deposit, but you want to help your children, whatever your grandchildren. And there is a pledge from the Prime Minister.
We will help turn generation rent into generation buy.
How realistic is that goal? Plus, coming back to London, you know the problems out west with Hammersmith Bridge.
We need a solution to Hammersmith Bridge, so where better to look than the military? LBC's Theo Usherwood. A bridge like over the River Kwai.
Something a bit more stable than that.
Yes, Lance Corporal Usherwood is on patrol and out at Hammersmith later in the show. 7:31, this is Breakfast with me, Nick Ferrari, here on LBC. Let's get the news. Simon Conway.
The leaders of 4 major councils in northern England have written to the Health Secretary Matt Hancock, warning the current local lockdowns aren't working. The authorities in Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle and Liverpool want new powers to impose their own rules. 3 of the country's largest universities have moved to online lectures due to coronavirus outbreaks on their campuses. Manchester, Manchester Met and Sheffield unis have all seen hundreds of cases since the start of term. Joe Biden says he and Donald Trump shouldn't have a debate as long as the president remains positive for the virus. The 2 candidates for the White House are due to go head-to-head for a second time next week, but the Democrat says they're going to have to follow very strict guidelines. The weather, early showers over northern, western and central parts will gradually become confined to the far north. Otherwise, sunny spells for most areas before some rain in the west later and a high of 16 degrees.
This is LBC.
The world is facing many challenges that are worsened by climate change, including conflict, the current pandemic, and financial insecurity. So, thanks to Tier Fund, LBC will be spending next week hearing about the vulnerable communities already feeling the impact. The week will explore the crucial role of a humanitarian worker and when disaster strikes, how people can work together to effectively manage the aftermath and rebuild. All next week, thanks to Tier Fund and LBC.
This is a message from the government. The law has changed. You must self-isolate if you test positive for coronavirus or are told to self-isolate by NHS Test and Trace. If you do not, you risk a penalty of £1,000 or more. Testing and isolating are vital to stopping the spread of coronavirus. Because this is so important, the government is now providing financial support for those who need it whilst self-isolating. You could be eligible for a £500 support payment if you're on low income and are unable to work because you're self-isolating. Find out if you're eligible at gov.uk/coronavirus. Break the cycle of infection, not the law. Stay alert. Control the virus. Save lives.
So, did you meet her on Our Time?
Yes, I finally gave online dating a try.
And you found someone as if by magic?
It's anything but magic. At Our Time, you meet people over 50 who are interested in the same things as you. You know I love my motorbikes, and so does she.
Join Our Time and meet like-minded singles over 50 who share your interests. Have a painting party, they said. It'll be fun, they said. Turns out, Prosecco and paintbrushes don't mix, and you can't always trust your friends to decorate your house. Thankfully, at trustatrader.com, you can find plenty of vetted, reviewed, reliable professionals in an abundance of trades. Like a painting pro, minus the Secco. After all, friends are for painting the town, not the walls.
We are all Elizabethans. How did we get here, and what does it mean to be British today? The biggest changes since the 1950s have happened inside our heads. What we think about class, race, sex and work. My book offers a different kind of history. One of attitudes, told through the people that made our age what it is. Elizabethans, the intimate history of all of us.
Andrew Marr's brilliant new book, Elizabethans, is available now from Waterstones.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Call 0345 6060 973.
7:35. Come to your reactions concerning the Prime Minister's speech, and also, importantly, the idea of turning generation rent into generation buy. But let's dive into the world of business and finance. I'm bringing up the conversation from Aquis Exchange, David Buick. And which bank now is looking for a new boss? David, good morning.
Morning. I think it's going to be the 6th in 10 years.
Yeah, what's going on?
Well, the trouble is that it's such short-lived when he was soon replaced by the current Mr. Andrew Bester.
Yes.
This is apparently a spat between, hang on a minute, you want to split up the IT systems between the co-op group and the bank. Sorry, the bank is sacred, and their preservation of their privacy and what goes on is absolutely key, and he's walked off the job. And to be honest with him, in those circumstances, I'm going to do exactly the same.
Let's stay with the banking and financial sector and talk about Virgin Money and gloomy news, I'm afraid.
Well, not that strong on that sort of front there. There are about 400 jobs at head office location. Some of your listeners may not remember, because it's not the best known bank outside of the North of England, the Clydesdale and Yorkshire Bank.
Oh, yeah.
They bought them. And
Well, the Yorkshire Building Society did they not?
no. Yorkshire Bank.
Oh, sorry.
Clydesdale. No, sorry, my fault. And this was an integration process. The whole thing was about 1.7 billion taken. With all these things that you never need the same number of people doing work. So there are going to be 200 job cuts at Glasgow, 50 at the Yorkshire headquarters in Leeds, and 150 at Virgin Money's office in Gosforth, Newcastle. Side of the Times, I'm afraid, it's just awful, but they are beginning to do quite well, and I think it's a question of being mean and lean.
What do you think about Tesco's figures?
It's all about costs. Everybody says, gosh, well done. 6.6% sales up, £26.7 billion. That's in one quarter. But the problem is, if you look at the share price, it's down since March, where it was at 250 pence to 214p. Yet, market share and volume of sales have gone up. But what's gone up with it is costs. And in the last quarter, there have been another £533 million of increased costs. Social distancing, limited footfalls, extra delivery costs, and all that sort of thing. And also, Tesco Bank is going to incur a loss of between 175 and 200 million pounds. Not a great scene for the new CEO who started last week, Ken Murphy, who came from all green boots. He's got a real job on his hands, and I wish him well.
We're just about to assess Boris Johnson's speech as regards his pledge towards people getting on the housing ladder. Just briefly, a city overview of what we heard a little under 24 hours ago.
Well, I think what worries us all is that the old mojo seems to have been back in the speech. I don't think there's any question of any doubt. And I think the only questions that people are worried about from our perspective is the lack of detail. Who's going to pay for all this stuff? I mean, for instance, if we're all going to be under wind power by the end of 2030, whatever it is, apparently the cost is £48 billion. And then when you look at some of the other things that they've got, some of these mortgages situation, which I think is very strange to say the least, because again, the banks are so heavily regulated that, there is a problem of whether you're